Before I begin, I wanted to add to the thanks and acknowledgements from last night by saying this event is co-sponsored by the Shapiro Initiative on Environment and Society, which is an initiative that owes a great deal to the Earl and Brenda Shapiro Foundation. They've given us a big grant to promote environmental history and environmental humanities at the University of Chicago. And we do three things every year. We co-sponsor this graduate workshop. Sabine? Yes, please, up here. Well, up here. Okay. Yeah, no worries, no worries. Welcome. So as I was saying, this is co-sponsored by the Shapiro Initiative, and we do three things every year. This is one of them. So we co-sponsor a conference/graduate workshop. And we also have a distinguished lecture, which happened last month. Some of you were probably there. It was Bathsheba DeMuth. And thirdly, and most importantly, we have travel grants for graduate students across the division who are working on topics that are historically oriented towards the environment. The deadline is May 19th for that. Okay. And then I wanted to make another acknowledgement, which is this gentleman up here on the wall behind you, Zach, is John Hope Franklin. Obviously, the room here is named for him. He's one of the great historians of the 20th century. This is actually the home space of the history department at Chicago. So we have everyone in history here has a slightly ambivalent relation to this room because this is where we do all our job talks as well as department meetings. So there should be blood and tears all over the walls. But anyway, okay. So I'm very, very glad to introduce the first panel, which is going to get us off and running to all the big targets for this conference. We're going to talk about reproduction and energy in the home. We're going to talk about the concept of energy transitions and metabolisms. So we have three speakers, and I'll just introduce them very, very briefly here. We begin with Robert Suits, who is an assistant professor of environmental history at UCL in London. Robert's first book, The Hobo and Environmental History, is on its way with Princeton. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think I'm allowed to say that.
Yeah. So congrats.
Yeah.
And Rebecca Wright, who is an assistant professor in history at Northumbria University in Newcastle upon Tyne. And her research is, you started off in US history, and now you've segued into energy history in the UK of the 20th century with a fascinating title, Carbon Bodies, Warmth and Fueling Health in Britain, 1918 to 2022. And then last but not least is Sabine Barles, who is professor of urbanism at Université Paris in the Sorbonne. She's going to talk about a project on energy and metabolism, broadly construed with a kind of longue duree from the 18th century to the present. Yep, that's great. So the slides are on this one computer. So you'll all be sharing the computer when your turn comes. So let's get started with Robert.
Sure thing. Thank you all for being here. I'm afraid it's a bit of a bait and switch on the abstract because I'm not going to be talking about transportation because that happens to not be what I'm working on right now. Also, if you want to know about my first book, this is not what that talk is about. So sorry. So it's become fashionable in energy history these days to kind of reject the idea of energy transitions completely. Instead, people talk about energy additions or persistences or synergies. Old forms of energy remain and then they grow alongside new forms of energy. Firewood was never replaced by coal, coal was never replaced by oil, and so on. The case of the United States, graphed here, somehow marvelously PowerPoint has messed up the color scheme, as it often does. But the graph of the US here is pretty typical. While the highest proportional use of coal in US energy history was in the 1910s, at that point, about 70% of our energy came from it. The highest absolute use of coal came in the year 2005, about a century later. You could write the same story about firewood, which peaked in relative terms in the 1880s, but peaked in absolute terms in the 2010s. Um, and you could write the same story about pretty much every other country in the world. Pretty much every fuel has never gone away with the addition of a new one. And so the green transition in this reading of history is a completely unprecedented task. Now, I think the intentions of this narrative are good. I think in many ways, the people who are writing them approach energy history from similar directions and with similar political projects as I do. But I'm not actually sure it's an entirely useful way of framing the problem. So today I want to defend the idea of energy transitions, or perhaps I want to encourage you to think about them in a slightly different way, because I think we absolutely do experience them in our homes, in our neighborhoods, and in our cities. Energy transitions, I argue, are primarily experiential phenomena in life and work, transformations in how the built environment feels, and that's why the idea is so powerful for so many people, and also why it's important not to cede it entirely to energy corporations, because it communicates something about the way that we live, and advocating for a transition is a way to advocate for a different kind of life. So this presentation is going to lay out some of the arguments of a planned second book project. I don't have time to fully explore everything I'm hoping to talk about there here. Instead, I'm going to keep it pretty tightly focused on the way the book engages with the concept of an energy transition, how I think that idea can be resuscitated and made useful for the current day. I'll talk broadly about the energy transitions that I've identified in some of my quantitative work and contextualize them in the longer duree of American energy history. I'll talk about phenomena of replacement, of displacement, and what I've called zombie energy. And finally, I'll turn to some of my current work on the geographic heterogeneity of energy transitions in US history. So the scholarly critique of energy transitions mostly seems to rely on the fact that one energy source has virtually never eliminated another. But while this hasn't happened in national economies terribly often, it happens all the time in a given economic sector. So by this, I don't mean that individual technologies are swapped out. I don't mean, for example, the replacement of like propeller airplanes with jet airplanes. I don't think that counts as an energy transition. I mean that across a wide array of uses, a suite of technologies has been created or replaced that has resulted in the abandonment of one fuel across an entire type of economic sector and a subsequent rise of one or more alternatives. There are 9, possibly 8, depending on how you look at it, of these in US history so far. So this is a chart from one of my papers. You can kind of see the highlighted in gray, the various energy transitions. So the first graph up there is of residential and commercial energy use. There was a transition away from wood towards coal from about 1880 to about 1910, and then an extremely rapid transition away from coal around the year 1950. Towards a suite of various fuels. Industry has a very similar track with slightly different timing, mid-19th century transition away from wood to coal, and then from coal towards a suite of different energy uses. Transportation has these dramatic shifts from a kind of wood, feed, and sail-based economy towards one which entirely relies on coal for steaming, and then a shift away from coal as transportation shifts, like trains shift to diesel, and there's an increasing reliance on automobiles and trucking. Agriculture shifts away from horses and towards tractors, and then a little bit later towards large-scale electricity use. This is largely the result of growth in broiler chickens and various kinds of animal feedlots. And then finally, there's an energy transition that we seem to be observing in the present day, though there are some caveats that I can talk about later, away from coal in the electrical power sector. Now, you might already see some of the commonalities between these transitions, and you might see some of the overlaps with what is starting to become a very critiqued age of coal versus age of oil framework. There's a roughly contemporaneous move coordinated away from biomass towards coal. And then there's another roughly simultaneous move away from coal in the mid-20th century. Since then, there has been very little change in the energy economy as a whole in any sector. And it would certainly be oversimplifying to say that there is a shift towards an age of coal and then a shift towards an age of oil. As I've argued elsewhere, the first one is more of an age of steam and muscle, and the latter one is more of an age of motors and muscle, where all of those are still existent. The modern energy economy, though, is one where most fuels are used in a single sector and most sectors are dominated by a single fuel. Also, if you're curious, most of these graphs are actually available in my energy transitions white paper, which is available online. It might be like the third result when you Google me still. It's also interesting to note that in all of these periods, the US was almost uniquely a high energy society. The American population used as much energy per capita in 1800 as middle income countries do in the present day, roughly 4,000 watts per capita. And abundant reserves of fuel wood meant that even before the era of fossil fuels, Americans were absolutely profligate compared to citizens of virtually any other country. But what I think is incredibly important here is that there is a move, not just proportional, but on absolute terms, away from fuels in each of these sectors. People effectively stopped using coal everywhere. And what had happened was a shift in the experience of coal. People went from handling energy every day to being increasingly alienated, from physically shoveling coal, from, as Fredrik notes in some of his work, noticing fossil ferns imprinted on it, from lighting their own boilers to flipping switches and turning thermostat dials. And cities and neighborhoods also shifted from kind of sooty coalscapes to urban spaces that, as they are today, are largely dominated by invisible particulate pollution from car tires and smog, but very little soot. And the experience of energy transitions actually goes beyond this. In my work on turn-of-the-century migrant workers, I argue that workplaces were radically transformed by energy consumption patterns. The experience of a steam-powered workplace is actually really different from one powered by internal combustion. Steam power, I argue, is clumsy, it's unagile. Steam engines can't be miniaturized to the point of being handheld or even self-propelled. So power is mostly available from objects that run on rails or were stationary. This example from rural America is actually pretty typical. This is a steam thresher. And you can see that it's kind of attended by this cloud of manual laborers who are doing all of the work that's kind of too finicky, requires too much agility and too much dexterity to do with the steam engine. And then over the course of the early 20th century, this transitions towards internal combustion engines, which are largely doing the work of everything. That cloud of workers kind of vanishes across most agricultural work. And instead, you have workplaces that are a lot more dominated by expertise, by credentialing, smaller workforces, and they're a lot more hierarchical. And this is a dynamic that's true of pretty much every rural industry that I looked at, in agriculture, in logging, in mining, and in construction. And in some ways, it's actually also happening on factory floors. But also, many of the same things are true in domestic spaces. So I'm currently working on an article from this larger project, which looks at how household heating underwent energy transitions. And here, too, I think the story is one of labor, of transformation over time as people shift to labor-saving devices, to fuels that require less handling, like petroleum or natural gas. But the experiential transformation is just as profound here as it is in waged workplaces. I see here the rise of oil and gas fuels introducing new visions of domesticity, of domestic life, which is bundling things like natural gas and oil with ideas of cleanliness and tidiness, with ideas of whiteness and patriarchal visions of household life. The energy transition is here explicitly pitched to people as a better way to live, as a different lived experience. See all the exciting new ideas for modern living with gas. This is actually one of the more restrained advertisements that I've seen. Incidentally, one of the things that's remained relatively durable here was, again, the appetite of Americans for a huge amount of energy, the embedding of energy systems into our domestic culture, particularly into cultural constructions of what it means to be an American. To be American is to be prosperous. To be prosperous means your home is well apportioned, means that Americans, whether in the period of wood hearths in the early 19th century, whether in the period of coal stoves in the late 19th century, or gas furnaces in the 20th century consistently burned more energy for home heating than European peers and people in any other country in the world other than Canada, which exhibits a very similar pattern. It's also true that if you look at historical estimates of room temperatures, they're substantially higher in the United States than they are pretty much anywhere in Europe. And those of us who have traveled from Britain to America and vice versa can attest that this remains true to the present day. I think the persistence of high consumption despite radical shifts in energy consumption suggests limits to the energy transition framework, but I think it's more about how we should interpret them than in rejecting their existence outright. And of course, the flip side of this is what happened to all the coal, and the simple answer is it goes into electricity generation. The problem facing national economies is not that we're unable to kick the habit of consuming a fuel. The problem is that once that fuel has been replaced in an economic sector, there's still a vast array of stranded assets and infrastructural pieces remaining to extract that fuel. So we found plenty of new technologies that we preferred to coal in the household, in transportation, and in industry, but we still had hundreds of coal mines, hundreds of thousands of well-trained workers and overseers, vast deposits of coal, a railroad network that was linking every mine to every major city of consequence in the United States. Plummeting demand, constant supply, coal companies who are quite intentionally strategizing about what to do with their fuel, all of that means that suddenly coal is dirt cheap and it can be turned to the electric power sector. So the resurgence of coal and its survival in what is otherwise called an age of oil is entirely owed to the electric power industry. And conversely, the scalability of the electricity grid in the late 20th century United States is almost entirely based on coal. This I refer to as zombie energy, because if there's any place in the economy that can absorb excess capacity of a given fuel, then effectively that fuel becomes unkillable. It survives indefinitely. And this is part of why I think contesting energy transitions frameworks is important. I think it's good to emphasize, for example, how useful a regulatory solution can be. Coal survived a full century of clever innovations, and it's dying out now, not because of any particular innovation, but because of a combination of new regulations, activism, and lobbying at the state level to replace them with cleaner burning natural gas. So, maybe not the best thing in the world anyway. But I do think that that is a sort of takeaway that we can take, which is immediately implementable in thinking about energy transitions. Now, with the last part of this talk, I want to talk about where I'm taking this work and thinking through how this intersects with the geography of energy transitions. So this is a map that the Washington Post put together based on census data of the household consumption of energy in the United States. So in every sector other than residential, most fuels are usually used for a specific purpose. So most coal is used now in steel making and concrete. This is all in the United States. And most petroleum is used in cars and so on. But home heating is almost unique in that a variety of fuels are used for the same purpose, but it's variable by region. That is unique in the present day because my work on historical energy geography, which I'll get into in a second, suggests that this fragmented geography used to be a lot more common across economic sectors. And while some of this geographic heterogeneity of home heating fuels is quite clearly derived from where certain fuels are produced, that's why Alaska has oil, that's why the Midwest relies primarily on gas, a lot of it comes instead from history. I mean, there's not a huge amount of New England oil in the present day and age. And also you might notice the kind of rings around central cities and regions otherwise dominated by a single fuel of natural gas in suburbia. So you'll see that in Atlanta, you'll see that in Houston, in Dallas, and elsewhere. So instead of reading this map as a mosaic, I would say it's better to read it as a palimpsest, as a many-layered set of overlapping energy geographies that developed over time as new pieces of infrastructure were developed to deliver new fuels to a given place, and people adopt each of them in turn. Now, a lot of my current work is focused on trying to unpack when these transitions and adoptions happened in different places and what the drivers were for each one. So one historical source in particular, up here, which if you're an Americanist, you may already be familiar with, is the Sanborn fire insurance maps. So these are made starting around the late 19th century for the fire insurance company. They include a treasure trove of data. They're available freely on the Library of Congress website for now. There you can see wood buildings, you can see brick buildings, but for my purposes, one of the really remarkable things about these is that they are labeled with an enormous amount of energy data. So for example, this is the Aysbury's AME Church in Baltimore in the years 1908 and 1921. This church appears on many other maps besides, but you can see that it's labeled with how its heat is sourced and also what kinds of lighting it has. In isolation, this single church changing from gas lighting to electric lighting in the latter half of the 1910s is maybe not that interesting, but multiply this by pretty much every church in every American city above 1,000 people, and you start to get a sense of the geographic heterogeneity of lighting change. And sometimes you can get a sense of the geographic heterogeneity of heating change. Or we could take this example, the Washburn and Ackert Machine Shop and Foundry from Charlevoix, Michigan. You can see that over the course of the 1884 to 1901 period, we see a shift in its lighting system, a shift in its power system. It adopts gasoline engines, and you can see the construction of an electric power plant nearby. So what I'm currently doing is I'm going through by hand, but I'm currently hoping to use some fancy machine vision voodoo to make it go a bit faster. And the hope is that we can actually extract the shift in energy transitions geographically over the entire United States across this period, which happens to align with the wood to coal transition. So we're able to see a whole array of things with a great degree of geographic specificity. We're able to see, for example, when cars arrived in certain places by when a gas tank starts showing up in random parts of a city. We're able to see when a given place adopted coal or wood based on when it starts building coal yards or wood yards in the central city. And this ties in with another ongoing project of mine to map historical American energy infrastructure, something that I'm happy to talk more about in the Q&A. I think this QR code is slightly disrupted by the Zoom controls, but you can find it at energymaps.ridsep.org. It is a site in beta, I will warn you, but this is all present-day American energy infrastructure. And we're currently working on a historical one, which highlights how these transitions have historically been dependent on geographic extent of energy infrastructure. So the rise of natural gas in the United States, for example, relied on the expansion of a massive pipeline network. These pipelines were relatively local to gas fields in the period before 1930, but then in the post-war era of the United States, there's an explosion of pipelines all across the United States. There's a widespread near national network, which became practical at the same time as the construction of post-war suburbs, which in both the North and South became premised on cheap heat. That's why on the map from earlier, you saw rings of natural gas-fueled suburbs, even in places where other fuels were near hegemonic. The two rose in tandem. Now, in the last half minute or so, let me pull these pieces together. What I hope I've convinced you of is that there is still merit in the concept of energy transitions. Specific sectors, specific places, and specific areas all have abandoned or rejected one form of energy in favor of another all the time, with massive consequences for both the experience of energy and for the way energy impacts and impinges on our everyday lives. These sectorally specific or geographically specific energy transitions are still meaningful analytical tools, even if they haven't extended to the entire national economy. And in fact, the exceptions that they do highlight, what I call zombie energy or the palimpsest of energy systems, are informative for the kind of green transitions that we wish to see today. I think rejecting the concept entirely simply doesn't accord with how people experience energy in their everyday lives and is needlessly obfuscatory. So instead, I urge us to kind of revisit the concept and tinker with it instead to better explain the world around us. Thank you.
Right. There you go. So thanks so much for inviting me today. It's a real honor to be in Chicago, and I'm actually so happy to be going after Robert on this talk because I think our papers actually work really nicely together. So the paper that I'm going to present today comes from a larger Wellcome Trust project called Carbon Bodies, which sets out to explore the intersection of energy and health and how those areas have been entwined in policy, infrastructure, and bodies in the past. I'm using heat as a driver of this investigation, being the most energy-intensive element of everyday health. Today, a quarter of total energy consumption in the UK is in the home, 80% of which goes towards heating and hot water. In 1942, this proportion was even higher, with 1/3 of the coal mined in Britain used for heating. Keeping warm, therefore, has been critical to the mobilization of energy, driving the economy and labour force, and leaving bodies ultimately dependent on fossil fuels for health and well-being. So Britain's post-war transition from the domestic coal hearth to electric and gas central heating was a slow process compared to the US and Western Europe. And I really love that Robert just gave a nice graph showing that, the difference between our energy consumption in the home. As late as 1970, only a quarter of British homes had central heating, leading to a mixed energy infrastructure that proves very hard to map onto official data. Again, another job for Robert in the future. This transition, however, clearly maps onto the emergence of the classical welfare state, which ran loosely from 1948 to 1978-9, after which it contracted under Margaret Thatcher's neoliberal policies. This is not a coincidence, but as this paper will show, the welfare state transformed expectations about bodily comfort and warmth that were materialized in new heating infrastructures in the built environment. As these heating systems became increasingly energy intensive, the responsibility fell back on the welfare state to keep Britain warm, a responsibility which, after the energy crisis of the 1970s, left it with a huge financial, logistical, and administrative burden. It is also pertinent to note, although I'm not really going to talk about this today, that during this period, the fuel sector was also nationalised, so part of the extended welfare state as well. The totality of the state's involvement in energy at both the demand and the supply side is best captured by a quote from the Right to Fuel campaign, who in 1982 pointed out, in many cases, speaking about their income comes from the state, their homes are built and let from the state, and their fuel is almost always purchased from the state. So the inability to afford adequate fuel can be seen as a failure of the state to manage its own resource. So what I want to explore today then is the different ways that the welfare state shaped the social relationship to energy in Britain, and how this was felt by bodies and the sensory and physiological experience of thermal environments. Talking about the operation of the welfare state, which itself defies easy categorization, can quickly become quite technical and a little bit esoteric. The assumption also that the state should bear any responsibility to keep its citizens warm might also seem an odd proposition in the American context, which doesn't have such a strong political affinity of welfarism. Indeed, the idea that the state should protect the warmth of its citizens was something that remained very much up to debate prior to and during the early years of the welfare state, and was also a right that had to be fought for. Indeed, given that 1 in 10 households in the UK still live in fuel poverty, the fight is ongoing. And one of my goals in this project is really to highlight how the right to warmth has been renegotiated over time and to reopen that conversation more broadly. So to make sense of these different factors, I'm going to focus on one particular material object today and use this as a prism to explore how the welfare state mediated between energy and bodies. So does anyone know what this object is? Any guesses? Oh, shoot, I've got, sorry, that doesn't work. That wasn't meant to be there. Oh, right. So this is a prepayment meter. Damn it. Stole my punchline. So in 1974, 2 million British homes, roughly 11% of all households, paid for electricity or gas through a prepayment meter. A survey conducted in 1976 found Britain to be almost unique in the widespread use of prepayment meters, making them a particularly British material object, woven into a particular energy infrastructure emergent out of the welfare state. Today, prepayment meters continue to be widely used and have become a symbol of poverty in austerity Britain, a particularly regressive method of energy billing due to the fact that they are often forced on vulnerable users who end up paying much higher energy tariffs. However, in the late 1970s, as the classical welfare state buckled due to widespread fiscal crisis, prepayment meters were seen as a progressive solution to a larger social crisis about who had responsibility in the state to pay for energy. In fact, it was the same poverty lobby that campaigns against their use today that were early supporters of the adoption of prepayment meters in fuel-poor homes. The prepayment meter, therefore, I'm going to argue today, represents a fundamental shift in how the state positioned its social role in relation to energy. So just to give a bit of context, I'm sorry if I'm rehashing some well-trodden ground. So the welfare state radically transformed social expectations around heat. At the heart of the vision of the welfare state was improved housing and better health, which came with the promise of more warmth. Britain was, and as Robert points out, in many cases still is, famous for cold domestic interiors. In 1942, a wartime social survey estimated that 74% of Britons only heated one room of the house, leaving a tiny 3% to heat 3 rooms or more. The future, therefore, had to be warmer. In 1961, the infamous Parker Morris report laid out minimum standards for post-war houses, stressing the social and psychological benefits of warmer homes, positing them as a minimum. The living area had to be installed with equipment to reach 65 degrees, which is still much lower than America, and recommended that heating should, where financially viable, be extended to more areas of the house, including bedrooms. Although much of the local authority housing stock built in the post-45 period was mixed, with many still depending on the coal fire, it did usher in a growing trend toward electric and gas central heating, especially in larger council estates and high-rise blocks where it was expensive and impossible to install coal storage and individual chimney flues. As a result, from the late 1950s onwards, new gas and electrically heated homes began to be constructed at pace. These were still not fully central heated, with bedrooms and the upstairs typically left cold, but it did extend heat beyond living rooms and hallways to kitchens. A major gas explosion in 1963, known as the Ronan Point disaster, revealed the dangers of gas central heating in high-rise flats and accelerated the construction of electric homes with underfloor heating. There was even a short-lived craze of building electric ceiling heating, which, if you think about the laws of physics, shows you how impractical and inefficient many of these systems built by the welfare state were. Part of the reason for this is because council houses were built by local authorities working to strict capital budgets, meaning that the heating systems themselves were often inefficient. The houses had little to no insulation, windows were single glazed and leaky, and the walls were thin. Importantly, these heating systems were built at a time when energy remained cheap and were expected to stay so. Local authorities focused on capital spending rather than running costs, ignoring how this would ultimately impact consumers both in the present and the future. However, almost as soon as electric local authority houses were built, it became clear that they were too expensive to run for many of the new residents. From the late 1950s, the National Assistance Board, which was a department responsible for benefit payments, was inundated with requests for support from local authorities for tenants who had been moved into housing projects and couldn't afford to pay the bills. Charity organisations, tenant groups, and other advocacy bodies began to draw attention to the high cost of running local authority houses, with many pensioners expressing the desire to return to their old rundown tenement buildings where they believed they were warmer with just a coal fire. This was exasperated by one of the coldest winters on record in 1962-1963, which turned heat into a public health crisis as pipes froze and charity organisation, welfare groups and public health departments were called in to protect vulnerable households. The hardship caused by the cold weather, alongside rising accounts of people unable to pay for fuel bill, led to a growing public health concern over an epidemic of hypothermia from 1964 onwards, where organisations such as the BMA started looking into the British Medical Association started looking into the issue, especially within the older community. And here actually you can see some of the early hypothermia kits that were distributed by local public health departments in response to the hypothermia epidemic. This public health concern was backed up by social surveys that demonstrated how people were economizing on heat and living in dangerously cold environments. One study of local authority housing in Birmingham, where there was a high number of buildings with underfloor electric heating, organised by an activist city councillor and my personal hero, Wallace Lawler, showed how large the problem was. Out of the 350 pensioners surveyed, it was found that 120 never used their underfloor heating and 75 only used it occasionally. 40% of the households visited in both modern flats and substandard housing lived at temperatures below 60 degrees. Fear of the resulting fuel bill and being thrown into destitution was identified as a major barrier to turning the heating systems on. Overcoming fear, therefore, became one of the key public health responses to combating hypothermia. Encouragement to do this ultimately lay with the benefit system through a mechanism known as the heating addition, granted to those on supplementary benefits, which included pensioners, those on unemployment, and those on disability, which typically as a category need more heat because they are at home longer, and also pensioners are more vulnerable to feeling the cold. And these were granted to those categories that were either in ill health or had housing that was expensive to heat, so that was damp or too large. This involved an additional lump sum payment for fuel on top of the general scale rate of the benefit. I won't go too much into this because it gets very nitty-gritty very quickly. In 1964, 604,000 assistant applicants were receiving the heating addition. It is important to note that the heating addition just wasn't about protecting health, but there was also a growing concern that the widespread economization of heat within local authority housing was damaging the housing stock, causing major problems with damp and black mold. By the late 1970s, some problem estates had already been demolished due to deterioration from underheating. So heat was also important for preserving buildings. Concern was thus both about bodies, but also the physical infrastructure of the welfare state, which also needed to be heating to a certain level to ensure its longevity. In 1964, the National Assistance Board acknowledged the cost of central heating was too expensive for those living on assistance when they established an automatic payment called the Central Heating Addition, granted to benefits recipients who had central heating in their houses. So this was an expansion of the heating addition and could ultimately be read as an admission that those living with central heating could not afford to run the systems on their current benefit payment. As more people moved into local authorities' house and struggled to afford the warmth, the number of heating addition grew exponentially, with the cost of fuel placing an increasing financial and administrative burden on the Department of Health and Social Security, which replaced the National Assistance Board in 1968. Well before the energy crisis of the 70s, then, to run much of the infrastructure of the welfare state to levels that protected both health and well-being, and the infrastructure itself relied on the social security system to heavily subsidize the cost of heat for the most vulnerable in society. So this brings us back, to how the prepayment meter could ever be viewed as a progressive solution to the crisis of cold homes. 1975 saw exponential energy price rises. In addition, we had about this yesterday in our keynote to the OPEC oil embargo and strikes in the British mining industry. The British government withdrew subsidies from the nationalised fuel industries as part of a mechanism for returning to market prices, leading to a series of steep price rises for the consumer. Between 1973 and 1975, the cost of electricity grew by 96%, gas by 40%, and coal by 61%. Within the Labour government, there was genuine fear about how low-income households, especially those who did not qualify for the supplementary benefit, were going to cope with these steep price rises at a time of wage constraint and rapid inflation. In 1974, 200,000 recorded electricity and gas disconnections drew attention to the scale of the problem. This led to growing concern about the social cost of disconnection, including the risk of hypothermia, falls in dark apartments, increased household accidents, and fires from dangerous secondary heating devices. The case of a 9-year-old boy who died in his home after starting a fire from knocking over a candle drew attention to the real social cost of disconnection, especially to children and the elderly. The Secretary of State for Energy at the time, Tony Benn, called for a ban on disconnection, arguing very clearly that heat should be a right like education and healthcare. Other support measures were proposed, including a £10 bonus and to extend the reach of the heating addition, but these proposals were ultimately rejected due to cost and also the administrative burden of putting them in place. Benn's attempt to ban disconnection ultimately failed due to opposition from the gas and the electricity industry, who argued that as they had to recover the debt somehow, it would just mean higher bills for everyone. They also pointed out that turning it into a legal dispute would place an undue burden on the courts, who would not be able to cope with the additional pressure at this time. As a compromise, a new code of practice was co-written with both the industry, the Department of Energy, the Department of Health and Social Security, and the Social Services Department. This did enforce a ban on disconnection for pensioner households during the winter months and set up a system of giving customers 14 days notice of disconnection. And this is the important thing, ultimately so that they could contact the relevant social service or supplementary division for additional support. This code of practice, however, proved highly controversial, especially with the social service departments who believed they'd unfairly become the intermediary between the fuel industry and the consumer. Both the National Association of Social Services and the Department of Health and Social Security protested the fact that the sector had diverted an energy issue into their already stretched welfare services. The National Association for Social Services, which represented local social service departments and social workers, pointed out that the social services had limited power to actually help a consumer in fuel debt, only able to do this really under the 1963 Child Protection Act, where an exceptional payment could be paid to cover a fuel bill if it stopped a child going into care. It was very specific powers that they actually had. DHSS also remained concerned that it lacked the manpower and resources to assess all recipients who were being disconnected at a time when staff morale was at a low due to labour disputes. Disconnection, therefore, once again raised the question about who in the welfare state should be responsible for ensuring citizens remained warm. Was it the nationalised fuel industry, the Department of Energy, DHSS, welfare officers, local authorities, third sector charity organisations, or the consumers themselves? Insulation also foreground the question about where exactly in the system the cost burden should lie. DHSS, for example, acknowledged that it would be cheaper to insulate homes than pay out heating additions after the receipt of a high bill or recovered debt. However, it recognised that it had limited power to assist with insulation, and improving efficiencies in the home. It could do this only in very exceptional circumstances, but lacked any widespread power to extend this into a meaningful programme. The promise of the prepayment meter, therefore, was that it sidestepped the different agencies of the welfare state and removed a heavily bureaucratic, labour-intensive and costly system. Rather than quarterly billing, it matched the capacity of low-income households to pay and mimicked other progressive payment systems run by industry, such as money boxes and post office stamps. To the poverty lobby, the appeal was that it ultimately prevented people falling into debt and being disconnected, and provided a system where people could pay less but more often. To the welfare agency, it was seen as putting responsibility back on the industry by developing a system that would keep consumers managing payments. This is why a 1976 subcommittee known as the Oakes Report, published by the Department of Energy, strongly encouraged the increased use of prepayment meters, forcing the industry to make them more readily available in households who struggled with their bills. In reality, what a surprise, the prepayment meters proved hugely problematic. They required a meter man to come around to collect the coins. They jammed often, especially once price rises went up and people had to put more coins in the meter. Collection proved difficult. People were out or wouldn't open the door to the meter man. And the meters, as well as the meter man, were often targeted for theft, leading, especially in the case of gas, to accidents. Most importantly, they were more expensive to run, operating with a higher tariff. And when people couldn't pay, they were automatically cut off. So technically, they were disconnected. However, they were no longer directly referred to the social services or the Supplementary Benefit Commission. These people did not show up in the data collected by the fuel industry, and rather they remained ultimately invisible and cold. So it is no surprise then that the prepayment meter was offered as a solution at a moment when the classical welfare state started to retreat due to buckling pressure from its responsibility of keeping people warm. The prepayment meter shifted responsibility from the state onto the consumer, who was left ultimately with systems that were too expensive to run. Focusing in on the prepayment meter, therefore, reveals something about how the state has framed its social relationship to energy over time. It provides a window into a transitional moment when energy was seen as part of the social promise of the state, a promise that was gradually withdrawn as more responsibility shifted onto the meter as a mediating objects between bodies and energy. So This brings me to the end. What broader lessons does this history tell us about the connection between energy, capital, and metabolism? Histories of energy have tended to focus either on the supply or demand side, but ignore the range of social policies, or what Sarah Royce and Jan Selby and Elizabeth Schoaf have called the invisible energy policies that mediate between these two spheres. These invisible energy policies are central to both the construction of infrastructure, but more importantly, how they are run across time. The history of the prepayment meter, therefore, offers a note of caution about not just focusing on energy infrastructure themselves, but to remember how these systems remain fundamentally constituted by and through the social and entirely contextual, shaped by the built environment, the weather, prospect, policy, prices, and people. In fact, one could even argue that through the prepayment meter, we can see the direct connection between our conference room, between capital, which directly impacts energy access and resulting thermal comfort, and metabolism, as bodies respond physiologically to temperatures inside the house. And that's me.
When I first moved into Kentucky,
Mhm.
the house we moved into had a prepayment meter, but not with coin operated,
Mhm.
but actually
Token.
Get the little.
I had one of those, yeah.
Do you? So.
I had one as a student.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your invitation. I am very happy to be there, even if I was late, and I really apologize. I think I lost my glasses in my journey to the place, so I don't see what is on the screen, but I think that I can imagine something. It is a challenge. I am going to do it. So I am going to tell a few words about these urban socio-ecological transitions. And I would like also to apologize. My PowerPoint is quite wordy because I am always afraid that I am not understandable because of my accent. So it's like this. And just to say a few words about where I am coming from in terms of research, it has been quite a long time since I have been looking at urban socio-ecological trajectories through the material lens of metabolism. There was nearly exactly the same word used yesterday. My concerns are why do things change? That means energy and material flows and stocks in societies and especially in cities. How do they change? And what does it mean? And there is an S, what should not be there, about relationships between society and biosphere, city and nature, and so on. And I have a particular interest in the transition from agrarian to industrial socio-ecological regime in urban context. That means that I had to address, as some of us, the question of transition, being a normative notion, analytic concept and so on, but it has been much discussed about the question of addition or transition, so I don't say more. I am also interested in present day situation, and of course this word transition is omnipresent in public policies, private strategies, and so on. And this talk is a kind of result of the encounter of these topics. I will focus on Paris because I can't do anything without empiric material, so it would be Paris. I don't know anything else but Paris. I will address both energy and materials flows and stocks. Just this table, I have not so much time to comment, but it's just to say I am referring to so the socio-ecological dimension of metabolism, referring, for instance, to the School of Vienna in Austria, and we can characterize three kinds of socio-metabolic, I say socio-ecological, but it is the same, regimes. And now we are in the industrial one with some characteristics you all know. So my presentation will have two parts. The first one will be concerned with the history and the trajectory, socio-ecological trajectory in Paris, this transition from agrarian to industrial system. And the second part will provide some thoughts about the present day situation informed by this history. So it is mostly things I would like to share with you. If we look at the transition in Paris and in a lot of cities in Europe and perhaps a little less in the United States, we can say that this transition is quite is very far from simple, far from linear, this word that has been used, I think, yesterday, and far from only additive, and it has also been discussed. And I am going to make a very rough separation between the 19th and the 20th century. This could be discussed, but as we have not so much time, I just think that it works if we go in rough explanations. As you know, 19th century was marked by intense food debate project about this twofold inherited socio-ecological crisis that was not qualified as such at that moment, but which was an external socio-ecological crisis with wood and food scarcity, which was very important in Paris, and internal linked to insalubrity, excess urban mortality, and so on, which adds to increasing urban population, industrial demand for raw materials, and etc. And what is interesting, if we refer to metabolism, is that there was a set of answers that were given to this crisis that are truly based on material and energy flow management without using the word metabolism, but that use most of the tools we use today to address the question of metabolism when we look especially to material flows. People in cities, not everybody, of course, but engineers, stakeholders, and so on, were obsessed with material balances, for instance. And this is very important, especially in Paris, but again, not only. And of course, there is this focus on circulation in 2 dimensions. And that makes the thing tricky because this word circulation has 2 senses, we could say, or refers to 2 things. The first one would be the flow. Things must flow, water, air, goods, money, people, etc. must flow, run, go from one point to another, and so on. In the first Congress on salubrity, one of the slogan, I don't know the word in English, is circulation, no stagnation. But at the same time, there is a huge reflection about what Leroux, the philosopher, called circulus, this idea of closing the loop on nitrogen, which is a very obsession of the 19th century, nutrients and material. That means that if we refer to what is the metabolism, we could say that actually, during the 19th century, the metabolism was more linear than previously. So the linearity of metabolism, I don't know how familiar you are with this, means that we extract, we use, we throw away. And if you look at the curve here, which are coming from the PhD dissertation of Anne Kim, quite old dissertation, but still very useful. You can see the shift in energy in Paris from wood to coal. And here there is no addition. Wood simply disappears from Paris at the beginning of the 20th century. And this is, of course, the representation of linearization because we extract, burn, and then provoke air emissions. So it is more linear. There is also, I refer also to yesterday, an intensification for certain flows, but not for all of them. And this is quite interesting when we look at how things change. If you look at this energy consumption, it is per capita. Of course, if we take the population, it increases. But in terms of per capita consumption, there is a huge stability. And this has been observed also in Vienna, Austria. And this is mostly due to energy savings, what we could call today efficiency. Efficiency, which is not called like this at that time, is an obsession as nitrogen of the 19th century. And savings have been much more important at that time than it has been after. But some flow, some resources are marked by intensification, and this is the very case of water. And regarding water in urban context, and especially in Europe and France, we could say that 19th century is the century of urban intensification in terms of water. Everything is done at that time, even if it continued to grow after, but it is this very time. But at the same time, and that is why I think it is very important to connect energy to material. Yes, the metabolism is more linear, but it is also more circular. And we could say that the 19th century is also the century of recycling. It has never been recycled at the same level than in the 19th century, for several purposes that are illustrated here. One is fertilizer production. In order to increase food production, it was necessary to provide more fertilizers. And the main idea was that cities had to give back to agriculture what they had taken in the form of food. And that means that street sludge, feces, urine, and so on were used to procure fertilizer to agricultural areas. This is illustrated by this. Ça marche ce truc? Yes. Ça marche? Ouais, ça marche. By this figure here, these curves with dietary nitrogen and phosphorus recycling rates during the 19th century, and you see this tremendous increase. Today it is nothing. We will see this in a few seconds. So it is an idea, but also it works. That means that there is actually an intense recycling activity in the field of city agriculture interactions. But it is also the case for industry. And here I have two examples, but there are many more. The most well-known is paper, of course. The industrialization of paper production has been made possible by the rag collection in urban context. But it is also the case for animal bones. That were very useful during the 19th century for many, many purposes. One of them being the production of matches through the production of phosphorus, but the main one being the sugar refinery, which was very, very important in cities at that time. And what is also important is to see that there is a kind of circulation between city industry and agriculture, as some byproducts from industry go to agriculture. Of course, and this is well known, during the 20th century, we could say that linearity wins. And this is due to several reasons. One of them is the fertilizer revolution that had an urban impact, of which urban impact occurs only earlier than in agriculture. It is very complicated to say this in English. What I mean is that the use of those industrial fertilizers became slightly in agriculture, but the impact of urban fertilizer production occurred right at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 21st century. And you see it with these curves here, which are the same than previously, but with the 20th century. Here you can see that phosphorus recycling rate increases, but it is only due to what happens in slaughterhouses where are produced where is produced food for animals from bones. And everybody knows the result of this. This is, I don't know if you said mad cow in English, the mad cow crisis. It is the same for industrial demand because some of urban byproduct became the limiting factor of industry, of increasing production. That is the case for paper, but also because carbochemistry, then petrochemistry provided numerous new resources or byproducts from oil refinery that replaced most of the urban byproducts that were used during the 19th century. And of course, at that time, we can speak about this great acceleration. So what I wanted to say, I forgot, is that for water, we could say that the great acceleration for Europe and for urban context occurred during the 19th century. But of course, the great acceleration is known to occur at the global level, but also for other resources after the Second World War, which is illustrated here by energy again, where you see that the question of oil in urban context is not so important for us. Oil is, where is oil? Here it is difficult to see, it is this. But primary electricity, that is nuclear electricity, has a very huge importance today. And here you can see the increase in carbon emission to atmosphere from the beginning of the 18th century, beginning of the 20th century, and to nearly to today. This is well known, but what is important is to put it into perspective with the pre-industrial situation, those emissions were very low. And of course, it is a globalized urban metabolism. Yes. So that's my second part, and I would like to share with you, as I already mentioned, what do we learn from this for the 21st century and for the current debate about transition and so on. My first point concerns recycling. So what I wanted to emphasize is that recycling was, during the 19th century, one of the bases of growth. It has allowed a part of industrial and economic growth, but it became its limiting factor, as we have seen for rags, but it is the same for other urban byproducts. So this points, of course, the contradiction of circular economy that presents the idea that we could have growth thanks to recycling, but it doesn't work, or it didn't work. It also highlights the need for sufficiency, with what we call in French sobriété, before efficiency. I have mentioned previously about energy savings. And what we see when we look at present day public policies, I go very fast with this, but we have with colleagues analyzed those policies and worked with the public services in order to understand how they take those questions of sufficiency, efficiency, circular economy, and so on. And what we see is that there is often a confusion between efficiency and sufficiency, and that efficiency is often considered as a first step to sufficiency. That is, of course, not the case because of rebound effects and so on. What we observe also is the creation of new path dependencies, because those new economic activities relying on recycling need waste. So that means that we need to produce more and more waste in order to feed those activities or to feed the incinerators and so on. And some cities have some problem now with this because they think about importing waste in order to feed the incinerators to produce it. The other thing I wanted to point is the fact that there are not only addition. What I mean is that, of course, everything increases, or nearly everything increases with this industrialization of the world. But what is very important is to look at qualitative changes and what I have called unlocking effects. And I don't think about positive effects, of course. I think about mostly negative effects. I think that, for instance, if we look at the Haber-Bosch process, so that this industrial process that allows to take nitrogen from the air in order to produce synthetic reactive nitrogen in forms of ammonium and so on. This is a qualitative change, which has a very huge quantitative impact, but it is a qualitative change that is important in this affair. And we can think about this, about present day discussion about electrification, which is very important, not only in France, but in France and in French cities and in Paris, where electricity seems to be the way to solve the crisis, energy crisis, carbon crisis, and so on. But we could say that there are numerous unlocking effects of electrification, because electrification means increasing extractivism. And which show also the importance to connect material to energy if we have to think about transition and so on. And I have no time for subtraction, but I would be happy to share. What I would like to say as my third point is about this question of transition, and I was very happy to hear what you said about this, is that there are multiple kinds of transition, and it is not the point to say there is not, and so on. The point is to say what transition are we speaking about? And if I take my point of view, which is more socio-ecological, I would say that the socio-ecological regime, the industrial one, for instance, is a combination of multiple socio-technical systems, and that a socio-ecological transition would be the emergence of a new socio-technological systems that replace or add to previous ones and contribute to change the main characteristics of urban metabolism, if I am concerned with urban metabolism. And if we take the very characteristic of the industrial socio-ecological regime, we just have to say that it is no more fossil and fissile, no more linearity, no more non-renewable resources, and sufficiency as a prerequisite. And if we look at public policies now, for instance, in Paris, we see that there is a very strong focus on energy and on an energy approach to energy, and sometimes on an energy approach to materials that makes impossible to think of something else. There are many other reasons, I know, but I just want to stay in the realm of what is transition and so on. And that means that some new socio-technical systems perhaps are born, but they just reinforce the industrial regime, such as electrification I have previously mentioned. So now, if I go to my conclusion, I would like to emphasize the fact that you stressed the fact that it was necessary to look at some sectors, and you showed this also, but I think also that the question of local is very important. And I would just like to mention an extension of this work I have been done for years now. It was quite logical for me, having worked about the past trajectory, to think about the future trajectories. And we have produced with some colleagues some scenarios of true transition for Paris and the Seine River Basin. So you can find them in French on the web. And what we have demonstrated is that there is a physical feasibility of socio-ecological alternatives. That means socio-ecological alternatives that provoke a true socio-ecological change in the regime, and that makes us going out of industrial fertilizers, fossil and fissile fuels, and so on. But of course, this is connected to huge change in terms of policies, but much more than policies in terms of politics. And that's why our two scenarios are one eco-socialist and the second one bioregional and municipalist. It is quite utopian, but it was very fun to do this in the present context, which is so sad. And that's it. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. We have, I'm going to call about 5 minutes from the break. That's okay. So 20 minutes. I'll take a cluster of questions. You'll start with please. Yes.
One Robert showed this graph where coal goes into electricity, and I wondered, because it goes even up a little bit after 97. So I wondered whether you have a way to show that it's a reaction of the oil prices, where I think part of the minute must put up again has more coal plants, or maybe an electrification of heating at the time, away from oil, but then some move to make the again. And to Sabine, I wanted to ask whether you can say something about the institutionalization of the recycling process in Paris. So how did it just happen? Because people needed each other's products, or was it somehow organized by the city?
Yeah.
Two quick questions. One for Rebecca, sort of thinking with Lale's talk yesterday, often at an imperial scale, the story about the way that kind of British politics articulates with the imperial politics of energy has to do with the interests of finance in the city. So Galper kind of leans heavily into a kind of Canaan markets argument, and it seems like there are profound kind of imperial implications to the social welfare story that you're telling. So I'm just wondering whether there are moments in which kind of you see domestic policy kind of articulating with those kinds of imperial concerns over the struggles over oil in particular that were happening kind of across the periods that you're describing, not just at the end of it. And for Robert, what about the grid? Sort of has the grid?
Listen.
These were terrific papers. Question for Robert, kind of building on Sabina's really interesting talk. I want to just push you a bit on the drivers of displacement and this idea of zombie energy, where you kind of locate this, I suppose, in a kind of path dependence of the coal industry. But we could argue that, you know, in the 19th century we see sort of similar, you know, resource transfers happening. So I'm just wondering if there's something more to this displacement story. The argument that this is sectors with slack capacity that can absorb seems to me to miss the kind of Frazot's style arguments that often centre actually on the electrochemical industry, like wood starts being turned into plywood much more, coal and oil of course into the kind of petrochemical industries that both Barles and Dominic were talking about yesterday. So I was just wondering, you know, having listened to this very interesting third talk, how you might speak to what is distinctive about that politics of displacement perhaps in the 20th century versus the 19th.
Right, take it away. Who wants to start?
I guess I can start. I'm going to buy time on thinking about Liz's question by answering the first two. So, Daniela, the showing coal going into electricity, coal going up a little bit after the 1970s, is this reaction to the oil crisis. Yeah, there's a wonderful book that was just released by UChicago alum Trish Koshla about basically the long course of the coal industry in the period from 1880 to 1980. Yeah, she shows very, very clearly that they're definitely doing this pivot partly in reaction to the energy crisis. Part of this story is that coal companies had been kind of the story of the early 20th century U.S. But then they start to be acquired by like the large conglomerate energy companies. So it starts becoming an energy company story. And these energy conglomerates can be a lot more strategic about like ramping up production in response to kind of like declining energy sources elsewhere. And they see coal increasingly as kind of like a fungible kind of like part of the broader store or like broader palette of like energy solutions that they're selling. In terms of the grid is super important, particularly in terms of like facilitating any kind of green transition, which I assume is kind of the direction of the story. Yeah, I mean, like, one of the big problems of our energy system right now is that we just don't have the infrastructure to move power from the places that have a lot of renewable potential to the places where people are going to use them, whether they're population centers or whether they're where people want to build, you know, the giant data centers that Leo was talking about yesterday. I think I think this is pretty much one of the biggest fundamental questions of like, how are we going to manage to facilitate a green transition, is how do we encourage people to kind of build out that grid. Without it, it's kind of hard to see a path forward. And this is also just kind of fitting into like the longer story of infrastructure. I mean, there was always a lot of energy resources in the United States, but they always kind of remain localized by the like slow build out of energy infrastructure, which takes decades and decades to happen for any given resource. I was really hoping I'd have a clever answer for you, Liz, when I circled back around to this question about what's distinctive about the politics of displacement in the 20th century versus the 19th century. I mean, you can, just because Frisso's book is on my mind, it's the thing I was reading on the plane here. I think like you can read this kind of displacement of energy, like materials, into like other material systems, and I think there's a lot of promise in that kind of approach. What I think bothered me a bit about the way that Frisso deployed it in particular in his book was that it kind of elided back and forth between like incommensurate kind of like ways of treating energy. Like there were, or materials, energy materials specifically, because there are points in the book where he talks about, you know, the carbon like emissions footprint of various fuels, and then he talks about like how those fuels haven't really gone away, but in fact their carbon emissions, but
which is one of his weird.
but in fact, like a lot of the carbon emissions do go away if you switch the thing. So like, what is the thing that we're actually concerned about? Like, you know, if you start making oil into plastics, then it's not better for the environment, but it might be better for climate change, right? And so that's generally why I try and like silo this really closely around like energy uses rather than kind of always folding it into an energy material nexus. I have been thinking a lot about like how to kind of like carefully treat both and like move back and forth between them, but I think it's really careful, or I think it's really important to be careful about keeping those different stories of materials like distinct, if that goes anywhere towards answering that. Yeah.
All right. Plastics as a carbon sink.
Exactly. It's great. No problems. Don't think about the microplastics in your body. It's
You
fine.
need the early sturdy plastics, right? Labels from the 70s.
Still washing up on the beaches.
Sabine?
Yes, you are referring to 19th century. Okay, it was not institutionalized, but because all this was organized by private companies, very big private companies, especially for rags or urine and feces, with huge amount of money, and by rag pickers, for what concerns the collection of rags, bones, and so on. But the public administration was completely embedded in this, because it was receiving some fees from the people who were in charge of sludge collection, for instance, in the streets, for people who were in charge of managing cesspools. So it had an interest in these activities because it was a kind of revenue for it. And some of the public authorities also said that it was, for instance, rag picking was considered as a very bad activity, because rag pickers were strange people and so on. But at the same time, public authorities said we must encourage this industry, because thanks to it we have raw materials for industry and then help industrial development. So they wanted to control these people that were collecting in streets, but at the same time they wanted them to be there in order to allow this industrial development. So it was, to some extent, it is a little ambiguous, but everybody thought that it was very important to recycle.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so, to be honest, I haven't seen that much conversation of that element, but I haven't really been looking in the places where I'd find it, because I've been so focus on the kind of Department of Health and Social Security records. That's not really been coming up, but two areas I do see it coming through is in discussions of conservation and the conservational strategies deployed in the late 70s, where questions of obviously energy security and those questions come up clearly. Another interesting question is also internal migration from empire. So what's totally absent from my talk today are migrants from West Indies, the whole kind of racial multiplicity of Britain at the time. They're totally, the discussion around fuel poverty is totally colourblind. It doesn't discuss race that I found, partly because I don't think the government are allowed to collect data on that area at the time, but also because, again, I have to do more work on this, and this is an area I want to look into. They're not necessarily living in the buildings or receiving the benefits. So a lot of the questions around internal migration are in terrace housing, and often are not utilising central heating systems. So where I see discussion about internal migration, it's around overcrowding, paraffin stoves, and questions of fuel poverty directly connected to secondary heating devices. So it's another element of the project I want to look into, but I haven't really got there yet, to be honest.
It's interesting that Tony Benn was the Minister of Energy, so that would be, I'd be curious about what he actually...
Yeah, Tony Benn is really fascinating. I've been looking again through those internal documents, and it's a really fascinating portrait again of his kind of the social intersection with energy policy through those, and the kind of, yeah, it's a really interesting collection of material, really.
All right, there's time for a few more questions. I guess I'll do another cluster of three. Please keep it brief. Yeah, don't you?
Okay, I think Miles had his hand.
Oh, Miles first.
Awesome talks. Question for Robert. Really appreciated the slide with the steam thresher and the tractor. I think that really illustrates your point. But I'm curious if you could speak to just the general idea that the corporeality and the experiential nature of energy infrastructure is grounds for resuscitating the idea of transitions by thinking about the current, what we think of as the current energy transition, right? Like, there are all kinds of ways in which you plug in renewable energy to the grid. One's experiential nature of energy infrastructure is the same and especially if you have a diverse grid, if you're just putting rooftop solar and connecting and still have natural gas or whatever, you know, I'm still flipping the light switch. I don't have 30 laborers like trying to deal with the pressure, right? So if you could just speak to your argument as it relates to the present renewable energy transition.
Dominic?
Yeah, one of the things I really loved about this panel is the way that you, in terms of the broader conference themes, is the way all three papers spoke to efficiency, brought efficiency up, and we know that a good metabolism, generally speaking, is an efficient metabolism, right? So I wanted to invite all three of you, any of the three of you who want to speak to this, based on your historical work, but looking at the contemporary front lines of efficiency work, whether it would be fair to say that when we're thinking about energy transition or transformation, that what's happening in the space of efficiency may be as efficacious, as important, or even more so than what might be happening in the logic of swapping out fuels or swapping out fuels for electricity. But the wrinkle, I think, that it also, and there's so much, our energy system is so inefficient that there's a lot of room to work there. But the wrinkle, I think, is that at least within the front lines that I'm aware of, there's a lot of emphasis being placed on automation these days as the way to excel. And we haven't really talked about automation yet, but I love if you have any thoughts, again, either from lessons learned in the past or your observations of the contemporary about what the politics of automation suggest for the making of a more efficient energy metabolism and so on.
Yes.
Aaron's question about empire made me want to ask Sabine if you could not speak to the role of the political regimes over the course of 2 centuries of Parisian history, but just to focus on sufficiency or sobriété, and whether you use the term eco-socialist, and I am wondering if the principle of sufficiency or as a value, which you clearly think is very important to bring in over and against efficiency, is something that's shared across political parties, or because it certainly isn't here, and with the depressing changes in the political regimes that you're marking, and the danger that France moves in our direction, I'm wondering what the fate of such an eco-socialist vision might be, and how eco-socialists are organizing to try to provide answers under different kinds of political systems.
I guess I can start again. Great question. Will you find 30 laborers on your roof installing solar panels? Yeah, probably not. I think this actually does speak to the question, like the experiential nature of the energy transition does depend a lot on what it looks like, though. I mean, like, there are different ways to get to a green energy transition, obviously. And I think the direction I kind of want to take this question in is actually to speak to Dominic's as well, which is to talk about efficiency a little bit. So efficiency being pretty much like I take it to mean this kind of like physics-based, like how much energy are you getting out that's useful energy based on the energy you're putting in. But I think one of the things that I'd love to explore with my work a little bit more is how this isn't necessarily the only like reasonable measure of getting energy, putting energy in what you're getting out of it, because there's a thing that's totally not captured by the metric of efficiency, which is more of a social efficiency, I guess. Like I'm thinking in particular of like trains versus cars. Like an electric car can be vastly more efficient in a physics sense than a diesel train, but the diesel train is actually still going to win in terms of like the overall energy expenditure. It's going to win in terms of the overall like climate impact, actually. So a lot of how we want to shape our cities maybe should be based on like this kind of, I don't know. Is there a term for it? Does somebody have a good term for this? For like a more of a social efficiency? If you do, let me know. I'd love to put it in the book. Any thoughts on automation? I don't know. Automation's generally a pipe dream that's used to control labor and has never actually worked out anywhere. I mean, like the case of the farm workers, what basically happens is that they automate the wheat fields, but they don't automate anywhere else. And as a result, they're able to switch to a substantially more brown, substantially more exploitable labor force. Hence why you get the pattern of undocumented immigration and farm work that you get in the United States in the latter half of the 20th century. It's largely down to the threat of automation rather than any automation actually happening. You still have that in the present day. People are like, oh, they're going to invent a like strawberry picking robot any day now. And they absolutely, and like I've seen like photos of people's like drones coming in and like picking an apple. And you're like, wow. And then we still use the same labor forces and still exploit them. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the question about efficiency is really pertinent in the case of this because, I mean, insulation is really the key to the heating issue in Britain, and one which the government is trying to, you know, actually without much luck pursue, partly because it's not as sexy as heat pumps, and they acknowledge that it's not such a, you know, crowd pleaser or, you know, vote pleaser, but what's really interesting when you look back at the records is, you know, in 1979, the government's doing widespread insulation programs, utilizing the Back to Work scheme. It's a really interesting precedent of combining labor and insulation in a kind of complete, you know, efficiency drive. And it makes so much sense, and it's such a good policy, and you know, we're talking about it again, but, you know, insulation has, it's pretty straightforward. It's really easy to, you know, it's pretty, you know, you can go up to your attic and do it. It's just, yeah, it doesn't have the kind of thrill of a heat pump or the technological kind of about it. So I think, you know, there's something that's very simple when it comes to not simple. It's not simple, but it helps, and it, you know, again, it's one of the biggest ways is to reduce demand, especially for fuel poor households who are not going to get a heat pump. The most efficient way to cut bills would just be to insulate, but we need a good policy to do that, and combining it with jobs. So, like, you know, being based in the Northeast is a very pertinent question around labour and jobs. Bringing jobs back to the Northeast through insulation is one of the best policies that the region could employ at the moment, and there's conversation about it, but I think it's there are interesting precedents in the late 70s for doing that.
Maybe you could call it a technology of sufficiency. And on that note, Sabine, last word of the panel?
Well, about sufficiency and policy. First of all, the question of what we call the sobriété, so sufficiency, was not so much addressed in a political context, but 2 years ago or 3 years ago, Emmanuel Macron said sobriété because there was a huge problem with water in France. And he said, but we had to be sober in terms of water consumption. And then this word became very much used by everybody, and everybody was speaking about sobriété, 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 sobriété. So that is for the main movement. So now if I try to answer more seriously, the question of sufficiency, of course, is very difficult to address for politicians because it is referring to I don't find the word. Comment on dit? Mais, pardon, I am going to find it. To punishment. You are punished because you consume too much and so on. And on the other side, those who speak really of sufficiency say that, and it was my point, that sufficiency can be imposed. It must be decided. So that means that it is a question of politics. And that means that those who are invest in this movement are at the very extreme side of the left wing. Now I can say we, because I think I am part of it. We are called by the others Islamo-gauchist because we are supposed to defend always Islamists, and we are gauchist. That's it. Or we are eco-terrorists because we are against some things that the government is doing. So what I mean is that this question of sufficiency is really in a very small world, but there are a lot of initiatives, weak signals in what we call eco-lieux, eco-places. I don't know the word in English, where there are some experiences that are done in order to put this sufficiency in action. But of course it is very difficult. I don't know if I have answered your question, but that's what I can say now.
Thank you. An amazing panel. Thank you so much.